Products on the lower end of the budget spectrum are always really interesting to me, and I always love to see how far I can push them, and what kind of use cases they might be able to fulfill. And so when AceMagic reached out to me directly to request that I review their new AX16 budget laptop, I was really curious to see what it could do. And actually, there is a lot that I really love about this laptop, and also a lot that I really don't love. Let's start with a quick overview of this laptop. It has a full aluminium build on both the top and the bottom of the device, which is pretty amazing at this price point. It doesn't feel particularly solid though, it's just kind of aluminium for being aluminium. And you might be able to tell from all these smudges that I've been using this laptop a lot over the last few weeks, and this is just what it looks like. You can easily clean this off if you wanted to, I just wanted to show what it looks like after some heavy use. On the top you'll see the embossed AceMagic logo, and on the left hand side you're going to see a barrel jack for power, a USB-C port, a full-size HDMI port, and one of 3 USB 3 connectors. You'll also see one of the 2 side-firing speakers. And then on the left you'll see a Kensington lock, and a micro SD card slot, which I am totally in love with, along with the 2 remaining USB 3 ports, and a 3.5mm headphone jack. Of course the second speaker is here too. On the bottom you'll see some generously thick rubber feet, and that's about it other than the vent. And for a budget laptop, the build quality here is actually pretty good. The hinge feels pretty solid, and the aluminium build is undeniably nice. There's also plenty of stickers for you to pull off as well, which is always fun. Now before we talk about the screen and inputs, let's briefly go over the spec sheet. Like I said, this is a budget laptop. And in keeping with that, this laptop comes with the Intel Alder Lake N95 processor, which is a quad-core chip that runs at anywhere from 1.7 GHz to 3.4 GHz. That chip also has the integrated Intel UHD graphics. This particular model of laptop has 16 GB of LPDDR4 RAM, as well as an M.2 2280 solid-state drive of 512 GB. And it should be noted right now that the storage and RAM can be upgraded fairly easily, and we'll look at that a little bit later. The battery is 7.6 volts and 5000 mAh, which the manufacturer promises to give around about 8 hours of battery life, and a full charge after 2.5 hours of charging. There are various other features like a front-facing webcam, which as you can imagine is total garbage, the 4-ohm 2-watt speakers, and very good Wi-Fi. That's right, this laptop actually comes with a Realtek RTL 8821CE wireless chip. That is a Wi-Fi 6 capable chip with really good performance, and we'll look at that in a few minutes. And finally, this laptop does ship with a legitimate version of Windows 11. And other than that operating system itself, this laptop does not ship with any viruses. So as you can see by the spec sheet, this is definitely a budget laptop, so let's boot it up and see what it can do. Oh shoot, I guess I accidentally uninstalled Windows already and popped Arch Linux on here. Well, let's just go ahead with this. Seriously though, I did actually test this laptop with Windows for a while, and it's just Windows, it's fine. But with low-end hardware, Windows is really getting more and more sluggish as time goes on. But I really wanted to get everything I could out of this laptop, which is why I installed Arch Linux after just a little bit of Windows use. Well, I have to say that the first thing I noticed about the AceMagic AX16 was its display, because its display is really good for the price. The screen here is a 16-inch screen with a 16:10 aspect ratio and a resolution of 1920 by 1200. It's an IPS display, not a twisted nit, and so it looks really nice. Now this screen isn't going to win any awards or anything, but it is an absolutely fine and respectable screen for almost any task. I think the colors look really good, the sharpness is good, and I have really no complaints about it at all. In fact, this screen is why I've been using the AX16 so much. I mean, I have a huge powerful PC, I have a handheld PC, I've got other laptops laying around. But as the centerpiece of the AX16, the screen really stands out. It's really nice. When it comes to the keyboard, it's okay. It's definitely not the best keyboard I've ever used, but it's certainly not the worst I've used either. It definitely has a dip in the center of the keyboard, which is common among cheap laptops. But overall, I mean, the keys are tactile, they feel fine, and I don't really have any complaints about them. Something I absolutely love about this keyboard is that it's a full-size keyboard complete with a number pad. I do quite a lot of 3D design in my spare time, and a number pad is absolutely essential for that, so I'm really happy to see it on this laptop. I know it's not particularly unusual or anything, but I'm just really happy to see it here. In addition, I think that the extra function keys are really useful too. In particular, I love that this laptop has a Wi-Fi kill button. so you can just switch off your Wi-Fi with a single button press, or I guess a double button press. It also has a display switcher key, which means that if you plug in an external monitor, you can use a keyboard shortcut to flip between your displays. And then there's also a special button for returning to the primary display. Finally, there's a button combo to lock the trackpad in case you don't want to use it. All of this is just really functional and really good. And whereas the keyboard itself isn't the best in the world, it's perfectly functional, and it doesn't have any glaring issues. And most importantly, it's just pretty okay to type on. And hopefully the trackpad is just as good, right? Well, no. This trackpad is absolutely dire. It is absolutely horrendous. And actually, outside of the screen, the trackpad was my first impression of this laptop, and it was not good at all. On the good side, it's a huge trackpad, but on the bad side, it feels utterly awful. It's one of those ones that has a lot of flex under your finger. So as you move your finger around on it, you can feel the entire thing kind of moving around underneath. It does not feel nice at all. And when you tap on it, there's kind of like a hollow ripple sound. For comparison, this is what my Dell Inspiron 5570 sounds like versus the AX16. And as you can probably hear, the AX16 trackpad is just really lacking. It does support tap to click and multi-touch, which is nice, and there are 2 physical mouse buttons towards the bottom too, underneath the trackpad. But those also just don't feel very nice, and tap to click is definitely the way to go, even though that itself is pretty awful. In fact, I actually feel like the mouse buttons are the reason that this trackpad is so bad, because it just doesn't feel solid at all toward the bottom side. If this was just reinforced and maybe the mouse switches weren't here, I think it would be a lot better than it is. But anyway, enough of that. As I mentioned earlier, there are 2 side-mounted speakers on this laptop, and they're actually surprisingly decent. The audio quality itself is fine, although it definitely lacks a lot in terms of bass. The audio quality overall is just a little bit tinny, but it's totally fine for listening to a video or something. I just probably wouldn't listen to music on this laptop. So the last hardware related items I want to go through on this laptop are the inputs and outputs. All of these are on the sides of the laptop, and unfortunately there are some issues here. Starting with the left side, you'll see the power jack connector, which is for use with the included charger. And right next to that you'll see a USB-C port. But unfortunately this is essentially a fake USB-C port. It doesn't support any extra USB-C features such as power delivery or display output or anything like that. It's literally just another data transfer port. And that is just such a huge disappointment. Now I don't necessarily need this to have like a fully fledged Thunderbolt-like setup, but I have a really cheap laptop right here that I bought for £100 brand new in the UK. Obviously this is kind of my rough and tumble laptop now, but even this supports USB-C charging. And I think that the fact that the USB-C port here is just kind of not really useful at all is just a real disappointment. So anyway, let's say that I want to transfer some files using the USB-C port and a USB-C thumbstick like this. Well, with this particular setup, the power jack connector no longer connects. So when I was installing Arch Linux, for example, I had to do it entirely on battery, and I was really worried that the whole thing was going to shut down. I couldn't pull out the USB because it was in use, and I couldn't plug in the power because it just doesn't fit. I guess this would be fine with a standard USB-C cable, but I still think the USB-C port is just way too close to the power jack connector. Honestly, this is actually probably my biggest gripe about this laptop. I just really hate that there's a USB-C port here with so much potential, and all it can do is file transfer. I just don't understand. And I don't think this being a budget laptop is really an excuse, I think it's just poor design. And also, there are 3 USB 3.2 ports on this laptop already. So why do I need a 4th one that just happens to be USB-C? You could just use a dongle or an adapter and you're getting basically the same thing. Anyway, moving on to the other side of the laptop, things are a little happier. And that's because there's a micro USB slot here, and I absolutely love this. Now I know that many laptops come with a full-size SD card slot just like my work laptop does, but I just absolutely love that this is micro SD and that the SD card does not stick out of the side when you have it plugged in. This means you get completely and utterly discrete additional storage for this laptop, and I think this is just fantastic, all things considered. The only problem with the micro SD card slot is that it's incredibly difficult to get the SD card in the first place. I ended up having to use a sim tool to just push the SD card in until it clicked. Maybe that's just with my unit, but it's definitely something I noticed. All in all, from a hardware perspective, there's not a huge amount of compromise with the AX16, and there are really only 3 glaring problems here. The first is the trackpad, which is just plain unpleasant. And the second is the fake USB-C port, which just really cuts off the potential of this laptop. And in relation to that, this device only has one HDMI output, and because we can't expand it using USB-C, you're literally stuck with just one external monitor, which is just kind of a shame. I know this is a budget laptop with specs that maybe shouldn't support multiple monitors, but I at least wish that that option was here and that it wasn't just arbitrarily not there because they did the USB-C wrong. Well anyway, let's go ahead and take a look at what it's like to actually use this laptop in terms of performance in everyday daily tasks, gaming, and emulation. And the first thing I want to say is, of course, I put Arch Linux on this laptop like I said before, but something that's really amazing is that every single element of this computer worked perfectly after using Arch install out of the box. I had no issues with audio, which, if you're a Linux user, you know that's basically a miracle. I had no problems with function keys, brightness, Wi-Fi, drivers, nothing. Everything worked out of the box, and this is easily the smoothest Linux experience I've ever seen on a laptop. Usually there's at least 1 or 2 things that won't work right, but it's absolutely not the case here. Everything I installed with Arch install worked perfectly out of the box, and that's on KDE Plasma running on Wayland. So yeah, really impressive hardware support on the Linux side here, and I'm really glad to see it. And in day-to-day Linux use, this laptop performs really well. The 16GB of RAM isn't a ton, but it is good enough for just some basic web browsing, and having a few different programs open for various purposes. There's a reason why I usually use Linux, especially on low-end hardware though, and that's because it generally performs a lot better and you get much more efficiency in terms of processors and RAM. And that is definitely noticeable here. The laptop performs way better than it did on Windows. It's just a snappier and smoother and just much nicer experience. And of course you don't get all the Windows bloatware in your face all the time. Suffice to say, the general day-to-day performance and web browsing, YouTube and everything like that is really great. When it comes to gaming, the first thing I noticed here is the excellent network performance of this laptop. Even though there's no onboard Ethernet, which I would usually say is a detractor, the Wi-Fi chip in this laptop is absolutely fantastic, and I was able to download a huge number of games extremely quickly using this laptop. I know that's not a scientific test, but suffice to say that the actual network performance is really good. To take that a step further, this laptop is really excellent for remote desktop or Moonlight streaming. You can easily set Moonlight streaming to the maximum possible bitrate and a 1080p resolution and get an excellent 60 frames a second stream. Anyway, I've downloaded some games now, so let's take a look at gaming. And all of the games you're about to see are running via Steam using the Proton compatibility layer. I'm using Proton Up to download the latest version of Proton GE, and that's what all of these games are running with unless it's otherwise stated. Now I would bear in mind that this is not supposed to be a gaming laptop, and that the N95 processor here is nowhere near a capable AAA gaming chip. So I thought at the very least I could show you a few of the games that did run well. First off, we'll take a quick look at Skyrim. This game is running at 720p with all of the settings bottomed out at the absolute minimum. Again, this isn't necessarily a gaming chip. But even so, I got above around 24 frames a second out in the overworld, sometimes reaching 30. When exploring caves, the game bumps up to over 30 frames a second. Now again, this isn't a AAA gaming experience, but you can definitely play Skyrim on this laptop. And actually, the experience is really not that bad. Next up, I have Tekken 7. This game is running at a resolution of 1280 by 800, with all the settings at low, and the rendering scale at 50. Once again, this doesn't look great, but it does run at a solid 50 frames a second or so, and it's an enjoyable experience. Another game that's pretty decent to play on this laptop is DragonBall FighterZ. You do have to play at the lowest specs possible, including a low resolution scale. And so the graphics look pretty muddy, which is honestly quite a shame for this particular game. But regardless, it does run very well at around 40 to 50 frames a second, and it's smooth enough for casual gameplay. And here's Sonic Superstars. This game runs basically perfect at 720p resolution and all the settings at minimum. There is a very slight judder here or there, but it smooths out the longer that you play, and honestly this is super fun. Honestly, playing older games or indie games is definitely the way to go on this laptop. So let's take a look at some 3D indie games. One of my favorites ever is Lunistice, and this is one of the best 3D platformers around, and it's retro themed and it runs absolutely perfectly at a 1080p resolution. Or rather, the window is 1080p, the game is actually rendering at a much lower resolution to give it that retro feel. Next is a game I enjoy called Superflight. This is a really simple game where you basically just glide or fly and try and rack up points by threading the needle and doing tricks and stuff like that. And you do so in randomly generated worlds. And this game, again running at 720p, which seems to be the sweet spot for this processor, runs pretty much perfectly on low settings. And this is one of those games that looks basically the same on low or high settings. Another one of my favorite indie games is Skyrim. This game runs perfectly with all the settings at default. And this game is great if you want to scratch that Ace Combat itch in a much simpler and quicker game. Next is 3-2-1 Grenades. This is a multiplayer arena shooter where all the weapons are grenades. And this game runs perfectly right out of the box, and is super fun to play. Seriously, you should pick this game up, it never received the recognition it deserved. And finally we'll take a look at Spark the Electric Jester 2, which is kind of like an expanded Sonic Adventure 2 clone. If I run this game at 720p, it locks in at around 30 frames per second and is perfectly playable. But if I lower the resolution just a tad to 1024 by 576, I'll get around 40 to 50 frames per second and it's very smooth and it looks just fine. And now for some 2D indie games, starting with Shovel Knight, which of course runs perfectly on this laptop. And so does one of my favorite games, Aqua Kitty UDX. Actually, a friend of mine composed the soundtrack for this game. And it's kind of like a 2D arena shoot 'em up where you need to defend these little milk mines from the aliens which are trying to steal all the cats. You know, it makes perfect sense. Even with many enemies on screen, this game runs great. Next up we have Indie Pogo. This is kind of like a Super Smash Bros. Clone, but where everybody's jumping all the time. And once again, this game runs absolutely perfect. Now I'm going off of the indie title here to just a couple of 2D games. I'll start with Blaster Master Zero. This game runs out of the box absolutely perfectly, and is genuinely one of my favorite games of all time. The characters are awesome, the soundtrack is great, and you can't beat driving around that big tank. And yes, I do know the tank's name is Sophia, in case anybody wants to test me. And finally, let's take a look at Sonic Mania. Sonic Mania runs absolutely perfectly as you might expect, but I thought it was really important to test the 3D special stages, because this laptop definitely does struggle when it comes to 3D. But thankfully the 3D special stages are just as perfect as the 2D gameplay. So all in all, this really isn't a gaming laptop, but you can definitely still play some games on it. I was particularly impressed with stuff like Tekken 7 and Skyrim. Even though they're nowhere near perfect, they're still perfectly playable. And for lower end indies or 2D titles, it's just a really great laptop thanks to that beautiful screen. But things get a little more exciting when we take a look at some emulation. And I'm just going to jump in right into the deep end here with PlayStation 2. First of all, I was playing Ratchet & Clank Up Your... well, you know. This game is running at 720p and is absolutely rock solid locked at 60 frames per second, and it still looks fantastic. Ace Combat 5 The Unsung War, which is a game that usually struggles, runs once again locked at 60 at 720p. And here's Gran Turismo 4, which again is locked at the maximum speed and runs absolutely great. And here's Virtua Fighter 4 Evolution. This game tends to run well on low-end hardware, and this is no exception. At 720p, it's locked in at 60 frames per second no matter which stage you're in, or which characters are on screen. And finally, I felt compelled to check out Dirge of Cerberus Final Fantasy VII. Usually doesn't run well on basically any hardware. There are effects like Vincent's Cape and the Fire that slow this game to a crawl. And even though it doesn't run particularly well on this laptop at 720p, there are certainly times where it reaches full speed. If you play at native resolution, you're going to get a lot more of that full speed as well. And overall, I just find this incredibly impressive, to be honest. I wasn't expecting this game to run nearly as well as it does. When it comes to Nintendo GameCube, the results are just as good. Pretty much everything runs at a 720p resolution at full speed. For example, I have here Sonic Heroes. This is a PAL ROM, so it's actually maxing out at 50, but I have no doubt whatsoever that it would reach 60 with an NTSC ROM. Except actually, Sonic Heroes here is running at 1080p, and it still reaches full speed, which is amazing. Super Smash Bros. Melee is another game that runs at 720p and absolutely full speed. And honestly, there's not a huge difference between 1080 and 720 on this display anyway. A different Melee, that being Godzilla Destroy All Monsters Melee, also runs at 720p at full speed. It's really looking like GameCube is locked in on this laptop. Burnout 2, again running at 720p and a 60 frames a second lock. And here's Mario Kart Double Dash, the same. So I'm pretty happy to call GameCube locked in on this laptop. So let's see how much further we can go. On Nintendo Wii, I started out with Sonic Rider Zero Gravity, and unfortunately it just couldn't quite keep up at 720p. Turning the resolution down to native did make the game run at 60 frames a second, but you do kinda notice the grisly image at this point. Still, visuals are one thing, but this is playing at full speed. New Super Mario Bros. Wii ran at 720p and basically locked at 60 frames a second. I would say I noticed 1 or 2 stutters in the first couple of levels, but that's it. If it did end up slowing down later on, you could easily lower this to native resolution and I'm sure it would play fine. Super Smash Bros. Brawl is another game that runs basically locked in at 60 frames a second at 720p. Sometimes there's a slight stutter, but it mostly resolves as shaders cache and stuff like that. And honestly, I'm really shocked that this game plays this well on this laptop. And if you were really unhappy with this slight dip now and again you can just lower the resolution down to native and it's going to play just fine. 007 GoldenEye is locked to 30 frames a second anyway, and it maintains that performance without a single hitch. This was really surprising to me. I really expected this game to have a lot of slowdown, but here we are. And finally I wanted to check out another one of my favorite Wii games, which is Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Smash Up. And once again I find a game that runs at 60 frames a second, locked at 720 without any hitch at all. Now I'm not going to go much further with the emulation testing in this video because I think I've pretty much covered everything that's going to work. And to say I'm surprised by this performance would be a massive understatement. The overwhelming majority of GameCube and PlayStation 2 games will run at least a 720p resolution. And on top of that, a number of Wii games will run at 720p or native resolution as well. I think that the performance of this N95 processor is absolutely stellar for emulation, if not quite as good for native gaming, which is kind of funny. So we've been here for quite a while, so let's go ahead and wrap up this review of the AX16 from AceMagic with my likes and dislikes. And I'll start here with my likes. First of all is the great giant screen, which is sharp and bright with good colors. Not an award-winning screen by any means, but it's definitely really good. Next is the N95 chip, because it really isn't that bad. It's a solid performer for day-to-day tasks, and gaming at low settings for older games works generally fine. I also like that this laptop comes with plenty of RAM and storage out of the box. It's more than enough for most normal people, and I've been getting around fine with it as well. I also like the microSD card slot, which provides discrete additional storage. I like that the keyboard is pretty decent, and nowhere near as bad as I assumed it would be. And I also like that the keyboard comes with various useful functions and a number pad. I think that the aluminium build is nice enough. It's not the best in the world, and this laptop certainly isn't a rugged laptop or anything, but it still feels pretty nice and it looks pretty nice too. It's also easy to clean, which is a bonus. Also, the network performance is absolutely amazing thanks to that Wi-Fi 6. It's great for online play, remote desktop, and game streaming. And it means that your Steam games, or whatever games you're downloading, do so very quickly. And finally, my biggest like on this laptop is that it's absolutely perfect in terms of Linux support out of the box. With an Arch Linux build that I bootstrapped myself, this is essentially miraculous. But from the second that I booted into Arch Linux for the first time, everything worked without a single compromise, which is just fantastic. And now for my dislikes, and the first one is of course going to be the trackpad. It vibrates, it's kind of rumbly, it's loose, and it's just generally not very good at all. But it is nice and big and it does work fine, I guess, so I don't know. Next is the fake USB-C port. I know calling it fake is a bit of an overstatement, but this really should have at least charging support, if not video output and all that great stuff as well. It's just kind of crazy that it's only data transfer, even for a budget laptop, because like I said earlier, I have a £100 laptop which has this feature. Also, I think that the placement of the USB-C port and the charger is not ideal. It means that if you're using a USB-C thumbstick, you probably won't be able to fit in your charger cable, which is just kind of crazy. And the fact that there's so much open room inside this laptop makes me feel like there really was a little more wiggle room here, that they could have just expanded these ports and given them all room to breathe. And finally, my biggest dislike of this laptop is that Windows 11 is included in the box. Okay, fine, I'll take this off of my dislike list. All in all, the AceMagic AX16 is a laptop that I actually really like, and I was expecting to not like it at all. And once I got it out with that awful trackpad, I really didn't like it. But as I've been using it really heavily over the last few weeks, I find it to be actually a really pleasant laptop. I think it has a pretty good price. I think that for that price you get a pretty good offering here, other than a few seemingly unnecessary problems like the USB-C port and the RAM. But hey, it works fine, and I think if you're looking for a cheap, basic laptop that still has some fair chops for general use, this is a pretty good one to go for. And that's especially true if you're looking for a laptop that works perfectly with Linux out of the box. If you'd like to check out the AX16 for yourself, I'll leave a link to it in the description box below. You can actually buy this laptop on Amazon as well, which is really nice. There are also other configurations available, such as higher end versions with the AMD Ryzen 5800U, I believe. But there are definitely other offerings, so if you like the look of this, there might be one for you. Be sure to keep an eye on the checkout page for any coupons, because often they're available. And of course, if you like this video, please go ahead and leave a like on it, and subscribe to my channel for more great content just like this. Also, tell me in the comment box below if you have a budget laptop that you really like. Like I said earlier, I really like the budget stuff. I think it's much more interesting than the stuff that you know is just gonna blow it away. And I think that this one is a really nice laptop in that spirit. I want to say a huge thank you to you for watching this video. Please do leave a like on it if you enjoyed it. And that's this one done. Thank you very much for watching Retro Breeze, and I look forward to seeing you again next time.